Hey folks, thanks for coming out. Today's lecture is focusing, of course, on gender and globalization. And what we're going to do is first overview a bit of the background to women's rights, gender, and the study of global society more broadly. I'll give you a little bit of context for how this area, how this field really becomes a key element to the study of globalization. Second, we're going to break down gender as politics, political economy, and global culture. So no galloping surprise there, state level, political economy, cultural levels of analysis, just like we've been doing throughout this class. Last but not least, we're going to look at a case study on female genital cutting, or FGC, and the ways in which human rights norms, and specifically around, around women's rights, have really impacted the international women's movement, struggles for equality and equal rights, and so on and so forth. So to start off with a little bit of background. For a long time, gender was seen as pretty marginal to the social sciences and to globalization. When I started studying a lot of this material, it was there, but it was seen by many as a pretty marginal element of the broader issues in globalization. This has changed, happily, for a number of reasons. One is greater consciousness about nationness and the role that gender plays in nation and national identity. This goes to cases like, for example, on soccer or football, and the ways in which, as an activity that represents the nation and the national body or the national consciousness, there are very distinctive gendered aspects to sports and to the field of sport more generally. But also in representation of the nation as the quote-unquote fatherland and motherland, and in the use of monuments, for example, and civic rituals to commemorate and to represent nation and nationalism to lots of people. All of these are very gendered forms of expression. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Number two, the production or reproduction of political economy through a sexual division of labor. Long story short, political economy isn't just about mathematical models, and it isn't just about the organization of labor in the abstract. Well, there's a social side to this too. Labor is organized based on perceptions of gender roles and the legitimacy of men and women doing different kinds of work. And last but not least, the rights revolution and the process of gender mainstreaming that have sometimes gone in hand with this. We're going to talk a little bit about the rights revolution and the change in classic interstate structures through which women's rights have been articulated and defended, and your readings will go into some of this in more detail as well. So, starting off with the background, even by the 1920s and 1930s, you see a kind of women's internationalism at the League of Nations, so the ill-fated organization that preceded the United Nations. This was after World War I. Where women's organizations are mobilizing, women's organizations are trying to get a seat at the table in relation to a whole series of issues, but aren't really being heard, partly because of all kinds of issues of ignorance, misogyny, and so on and so forth. But then also because, excuse me, also because the League of Nations, like so many other organizations, is focused on states and is very much built around the statist framework. And so something like women's rights, which are by definition global sorts of issues, don't really get a whole lot of room. Under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, it's a little better, but not necessarily a whole lot better. Article 16, paragraph 1 of the UDHR mentions men and women and makes a note of women's rights. There are a couple of other mentions of it as well, but honestly, the place of gender in classic human rights instruments isn't really all that obvious. The classic emphasis of human rights is on states' rights and responsibilities, and so issues like gender are hard to really pack into this framework. Well, what's going to happen is that by the 1970s, we're going to see a whole series of mobilizations from non-governmental organizations, from cooperative organizations, really pushing women's issues, or not women's issues, but gender-based, really pushing gender-related issues onto a global stage. That's what I wanted to say. So, pressure from Hilke Pietial. I apologize to anybody who speaks Finnish because I'm sure I mispronounced that. And the Women's International Democratic Federation eventually drives the creation of the Mexico City Conference in 1975, at which is created the UN Decade for Women 1976 to 85. During this time, CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, is going to be passed in 1979 and become a key plank, a key element of the broader issues around human rights. At the UN Vienna Conference on Human Rights in 1993, there is a big push to create a UN World Conference on Women, which will take place in 1995 in Beijing, China, and the creation of what is known as the Beijing Platform, which in a lot of ways completes the work that CEDAW had started in 79 but never really kind of had finished. So, for example, it's from 1995 onwards that international law specifically spells out that women who are facing gender-based violence can indeed be refugees, or that gender-based violence can be a reason for seeking asylum. And this might seem terribly obvious, but until then, there was no international legal instrument that said this. And so this by itself becomes a big deal. Countries start to implement gender-based violence legislation into their own national laws on asylum, and you see a little bit of how this works as the legal framework articulated internationally peters into national legislations, national rulings, national court judgments, and so on and so forth. Year 2000, the UN Security Council issues a resolution on gender and gender-based violence. Gender-related goals are included in the Millennium Development Goals, the UN's MDGs, from 2000 to 2015 being the framework in which they're supposed to be accomplished. And we really are entering a very different level of different kinds of issues, where all of a sudden the role of gender at the level of the state, at the level of international law and national law, is taken much more seriously and is much more visible at the very least than it had been previously. Well, it's not just states that are involved in this, and of course here's where we transition to the level of international political economy. The Decade for Women, truth be told, focused on women's rights. This is absolutely true. But it was also linking women to the development of their countries. Many of the arguments coming from the UN at this time were focused on the idea that women were a quote-unquote untapped resource for national development, and that they could contribute to productivity and to the labor force in ways that they weren't always allowed to, they hadn't always been allowed to up until this point in time. So labor and the mobilization of women in the workforce becomes a really obvious, visible issue, and becomes an issue that's increasingly part of politics, society, and culture. But we also start to see what gets referred to as the sexual division of labor. In other words, the ways in which the labor force, both nationally and globally, is stratified based on gender roles and gender identities. So a few examples of this. One, national scale policies and structures very obviously pay discrimination, the denial of entry of women into certain areas of the workforce, and so forth. Two, specific sectoral demands, like, for example, the way the global garment industry has, quote-unquote, grown up and become global really through women's labor and really through women's work, and the way this has helped condition ideas of the place of women in global value chains. And last but not least, global care chains, basically the organization of migrant labor around the world to deal with what are sometimes referred to as the quote-unquote caring industries, so nursing aides, people taking care of young kids, and so on and so forth. And your readings have a little bit of material on this, and on the way particularly Filipino migrant labor has been central to the creation of global care chains around the world, in Saudi Arabia, in Canada, and in a whole series of other countries. But it's not just IPE, it's not just economy, and it's not just formal rights. It's also a series of questions about culture. So to start off with the more lighthearted version of this, you've probably all seen pictures of Vladimir Putin with his shirt off doing, well, all kinds of things, actually. And obviously, this is a very gendered example of the way gender norms conflate with claims to political power and cultural norms. Vladimir Putin, riding horses or fishing, or in the more photoshopped version, riding bears and sharks and stuff like this. It's a very gendered way of representing and encapsulating the nation. And it's silly, but it also has a clear purpose. It also has a very clear normative structure and normative purpose, I think. There are other ones, of course, there are other examples which aren't quite so silly and which are a little bit more serious. So, October 1982, there's this classic example where at the White House press conference, the issue of AIDS really is taken as a joke, is really taken as something to laugh about. And you can see Larry Speakes here, the President Reagan's press secretary, basically looking at HIV/AIDS as really something that does not have to be taken seriously because it's a quote unquote gay plague. It's something that only affects gays and lesbians. And the idea that somehow this is not a mainstream concern is bound up with gender roles and ideas of masculinity in very clear and obvious ways. And your readings talk about this case a little bit further. Other examples that are perhaps a little, that kind of flesh out this idea a little bit more, is the way that national monuments and national icons really sort of either promote or frame gender in very specific ways. In Canada, the personhood case was central to this in 1929, in which the Privy Council judges that women were in fact persons in the sense of Section 24 of the British North America Act. Long story short, there was a monument to Emily Murphy, who's on the left over there. I know all my slides come up, but who's on the left over there with her right hand on the chair in the statue in Ottawa, Canada. Really sort of encapsulating gender norms, but also putting struggles for gender equality in a very central, monumental place in the nation's capital. In Germany, the Neue Wache statue that you see over there on the left is bound up in national identity, but also in Christian iconography in all kinds of ways. And in France, Jeanne d'Arc Marianne, as sort of represents a complex double face of French nationalism, both women who have been appropriated by political movements in their symbolism and in their symbolism in contemporary France, where Jeanne d'Arc is appropriated by the French right very often, and Marianne by the French left. So you sort of see the ways in which gender norms become part of forms of memorialization, forms of incarnating the nation in different contexts and in different places around the world. More generally, if we want to spend a little bit of time schematizing this, we can sort of see how women's rights become an element of global culture throughout all of us, where we have this model that I think I've used before of world culture or geoculture basically being broken up into three different components here: the nation-state system, organizations and associations, and identities and citizenship. And we sort of see how the identities and citizenships part isn't just accidental or isn't just peripheral, it's actually very central to the nation and the nation-state system, where ideas of statehood, ideas of legitimacy, are actually bound up in cultural norms of gender and the place of women in society more broadly. So, just to wrap up for over here, we can see from all of this and from the materials we have issues on the recognition of the social construction of gender and the social construction of the place of gender norms in societies more broadly. Secondly, the way that intergovernmental structures have, on one hand, really advanced women's rights and really sort of defined women's rights in far more detail than was the case 40 or 50 years ago, but at the same time really highlights some of the limits of state-focused analysis and some of the limits of what you can do with some of these UN-based tools. Then the shifting parameters of the sexual division of labor, of course. As time has gone on, the idea of women's work, so to speak, has changed and keeps on changing, and this has important implications and repercussions for the broader global division of labor. And the role of norms and the campaign to end FGC, through a mix of NGO and state-based activism. And this is some of the material we have on a case study in this unit of the class. Thanks very much.